In our last lecture on the book of Revelation, our introduction, I mentioned that all seem to agree that the book of Revelation is the most difficult book in the Bible to deal with, to know what to do with. I agree with this assessment. It is very difficult. But as all the books of the Bible, it is written for our profit. It is written for us to be edified and to be instructed from. Paul said all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for instruction in righteousness. It's profitable for correction. It's profitable for reproof. It's profitable for our growth, that we might be thoroughly furnished unto every good work, Paul said. And so, as with the other books of the Bible, so also with the book of Revelation, there is a profit in it for us, and the book itself promises that there will be. I mentioned that the book of Revelation actually is a unique book in that it fills three literary genres. It is at once an epistle, which is true of most of the New Testament books, but it is unlike the other epistles in the New Testament in that it is also a prophecy. It's a book of prophecy. It says so. In chapter 1, verse 3, it says the words of this prophecy. Now, it is an epistle written to actual churches, but it's a prophetic book. And in that sense, it's a lot like some of the books of the Old Testament, like Daniel or Ezekiel or Zechariah. It's comprised of visions that were seen and reported by John, the author. Now, no other epistle in the New Testament is a prophetic book. There are some prophecies in other books of the New Testament. Jesus uttered a few prophecies in the Gospels. Paul utters a prophecy or two in his epistles. But for the most part, the epistles of the Bible are not about prophecy, and therefore this epistle is different than others, in that it is both an epistle and a prophecy, and it is a third thing too. It is an apocalypse. Now, the term apocalypse actually is a term that was coined from the book of Revelation itself. The name of the book in Greek is the Apocalypsis and is anglicized to the form apocalypse. So apocalypse is actually the name of the book. But after many centuries after the church had become familiar with the book of Revelation, other books were discovered. In the 1940s particularly, a cache of ancient literature was discovered in Egypt containing quite a number of books of the same type. And since this was a specific and identifiable genre that resembled the book of Revelation in its style, scholars have come to call all the books of that genre apocalyptic. Although those books all predate the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation gives its name to the genre because the book of Revelation has been familiar longer. And now we have discovered more books of the same type, and so they are given a name that means like the book of Revelation. Apocalyptic, it means like this book. But the ways in which they are like the book of Revelation demonstrate that there was a whole class of literature that was popular among the Jewish people and among the early Christians that was written in this style, so that when the book of Revelation was written, it was not as strange to the original readers as it is to us. It actually fit very neatly into a type of literature that they were reading already. And it was a type of literature that used symbolic images and depicted wars, rise and fall of kingdoms and so forth in language that's like cosmic disturbances, like the heavens were falling. Like they were earthquakes and tidal waves, and certain political entities were depicted as monsters and dragons and such. In the apocalyptic literature in general, the author claims to be somebody famous, although the actual apocalyptic literature outside of the book of Revelation is usually what they call pseudepigraphal literature, which means it was written by someone different than who it claims to be written by. The apocalyptic literature prior to Revelation was written usually in the 2 centuries before Christ and the 1st century after Christ, a period of about 300 years. A lot of books of this type were generated, but all of them except Revelation, where the authors claimed to be somebody that they weren't. They claimed to be someone famous, but they were not. John, however, doesn't claim to be anyone famous. He just calls himself John and expects his readers to know who he is. He doesn't even say he's a famous John. He doesn't even say he's John the Apostle, which would be something to say if you're claiming to be someone famous, and you're not. He's just really John. That's his real name. And yet, he receives a revelation from Jesus Christ, which he reports. And interestingly, Jesus accommodates the tastes of the readership. Because Jesus can give his revelation any way he wants to, but he actually adapts his message to a style of literature that was already popular among his readership. God gave this revelation to John in a style that his readers would be acquainted with because they read many other books of the same type. Not the same type in the sense of being inspired prophecies, but in the same style of expression, with dragons and monsters, and earthquakes and mountains moving and things like that, stars falling. Those kinds of images are very commonplace. And the writer of the other literature of the same type always claimed that angels were giving them a guided tour of these things and explaining the things to them. Well, the book of Revelation has all those features. The difference is Revelation is actually written by a man who got a revelation from God. Jesus Christ actually appeared to John and told him take a letter and dictated these letters to the 7 churches and then caught him into heaven and showed him things. That he claims that this is a real prophecy sets this book apart from the other apocalypses that were popular in his day, because they don't claim to be inspired. They don't claim to be prophecies. They're just fanciful fiction. But this is not. This is a real revelation from God. Now, we talked last time about the authorship because I consider the authorship of a given book to be all important. Because if the author is an apostle of Jesus Christ, then on that basis, his writings belong in the New Testament. That is, in fact, the qualification for a book being included in the New Testament. People say, well, why weren't the Gnostic Gospels included in the New Testament? Weren't there a lot of other books besides these 27 books that they wanted to put in and somebody removed? The popular yarn is that Constantine removed them because he didn't like their theology. Of course, that has nothing to do with the truth. The choice of the books of the New Testament is based on one criterion. Is it apostolic? The reason that the Gnostic Gospels, for example, are not in our Bible is because they were not written by apostles, although the authors lied and claimed they were. The Gnostic Gospels, for example, which we hear so much about now, were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries after the apostles were long dead, but they claim to be Peter and Thomas and Philip and Mary Magdalene, who were the writers. But they were liars. Now, if you're considering a book for inclusion in the Bible, and the very first lines in the book are a lie, it raises questions about the authenticity of the rest of the book. If the author can't tell the truth about who he is, who knows whether he can tell the truth about anything? And that is why the Gnostic Gospels are not in our Bible, and many other works that were rejected. The criterion for including a book in the Bible, in the New Testament at least, is that it must be written by an apostle, or at least an apostolic associate. That is, somebody so close to the apostles that he could not possibly have written without their oversight. Someone like Luke, who traveled incessantly with Paul, and no doubt wrote both Luke and Acts while Paul was with him, and probably didn't sneak it out without Paul taking a look at it. After all, Acts was mostly about Paul. I doubt if Luke would have published that without Paul proofreading it at the very least. The fact that Luke was so closely associated with Paul means that his books are apostolic, at least receive apostolic approval. Likewise, Mark, who traveled with Peter, though Mark was not an apostle, his book is considered apostolic because the early fathers said that Mark was simply translating what Peter preached. So that gospel, though we call it the Gospel of Mark, is really the gospel according to Peter as translated by Mark. So, in other words, to include a book in our Bible, in our New Testament requires that the author is apostolic. Is the author of Revelation apostolic? That took a long time for the church to decide. The book of Revelation was the last book to be accepted into the New Testament by the church. It wasn't until 396 AD that the church finally decided to include it. The question was it written by John the Apostle or another John? The author 5 times refers to himself as John. He simply says, I, John. He does not say which John he is, which is one of the strongest arguments for being the apostle. Because in the time of the Apostle John, anyone named John would have to tell who he was unless he was the Apostle John. The Apostle John was the most famous John in the church, probably the last surviving apostle in those days. To simply say John would call to mind John the Apostle unless one would qualify this. No, I'm John, this other guy. I'm not the John, I'm another John. And the author just calls himself John, and the early church, for the most part, all the church fathers whose writings have come down to us have said this was the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, brother of James, one of the 4 fishermen, one of the 2 sons of thunder, one of the 12 apostles, and part of the inner circle of 3, and the one that Jesus loved. That's that John. And if it was that John who wrote it, then the book belongs in our Bible just like the Gospel of John, or the Epistles of John, or any other book written by any apostle belongs in our Bible. And I accept that John did write it, but that was disputed for some time, and actually continues to be disputed among some, because the style of Greek is very different in Revelation than in John's other known writings. And so some have thought a different man must have written it, but we talked last time about various reasons why that style could differ and still be by the same man. We will not go over that again. We come now to important considerations that we have to look at if we're going to make sense out of a book that is really quite enigmatic, a book that has symbols that puzzle most people. I perhaps should say that puzzle all people, except for people that don't realize they're puzzled. There are people who think the first reading, they say, oh, I get it. And what they mean is, I just take it at face value. You know, I just read what it says and I just believe what it says. God, and I've heard people say this, God says what he means and he means what he says. Therefore, if it says the blood shall flow to the horses' bridles, then so be it. The blood's going to flow up to the horses' bridles. Literally, God wouldn't say if he didn't mean it. On the other hand, the book is full of symbolism. And you can't take everything just at face value. For example, in Revelation 5:6, John sees Jesus. What does Jesus look like? Well, you and I should suspect that Jesus looks like a man with holes in his hands and feet. That's what he looked like when he appeared to his disciples after his resurrection and when he ascended into heaven. But when John sees Jesus in Revelation 5:6, he sees a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns. Now, I think any reasonable person would recognize that's a symbolic description of Jesus. He is not literally a lamb. To call him the lamb conveys certain information about his redemptive sacrifice, but he is not a lamb. He does not have wool. He does not walk on all fours. He does not have cloven hooves. And he does not have 7 eyes and 7 horns. He's not that monstrous. But 7 eyes and 7 horns are very meaningful symbols in the Jewish symbolism and numerology. So we can see that Jesus is not at all depicted literally. Something like 27 times in the book he's called the Lamb. That's the normal term for Jesus, the Lamb. And that is a symbol. As I said last time, we are so accustomed to thinking of Jesus as the Lamb of God, or even depicting him as a lamb in Christian iconography and classical artwork, that we forget, oh yeah, a lamb, that's not a literal description of him. He really is not a lamb. He's a person, a human being. But he is called the Lamb, and that's a symbolic way of speaking of him. The devil is called a dragon. The devil is not a dragon. He's a spirit. He's not a mythical beast, nor is he literally a serpent. He's called that too. The devil is not a reptilian. He is a spirit being, but he is depicted symbolically as a dragon and as a reptile. That's how Revelation is. It's written in symbols. And people say, well, I just take it at face value. Well, they're going to be misunderstanding it. They're confused, but they don't know they are. The person is much better off who reads the book of Revelation and knows they're confused, and knows that there's more here than immediately meets the eye, and that there's things to contemplate, things to research, things to meditate upon, things to pray about, things to compare Scripture with Scripture to gain understanding and to interpret. That's what a book like this requires. Now, I mentioned that I sometimes meet people who say, well, the Bible wasn't written for scholars. Why should we have to learn Greek or Hebrew? The Bible was written for common people. But of course the answer is the Bible was written for common people who read Greek and Hebrew, not who read English. People who don't read Greek and Hebrew have to study it to know it. We don't know it intuitively. They did. Common people back then knew some things already that we have to study a great deal to know. They knew what apocalyptic literature was. They read a lot of it. They knew that certain books were written to convey certain ideas in a certain strange way. They had read many books of that type. We have not. The book of Revelation may be the only book we've read like that. And if we've read any others, it's probably Daniel or Zechariah. But we do not read a lot of books like this, and therefore studying the whole genre of apocalyptic literature becomes helpful to us, although it would be unnecessary for the original readers. They already had that familiarity already in place as part of their mental furniture. That doesn't come with us factory installed. We have to learn it. And so that's why we have to look into these matters. Now, one thing we have to understand about Revelation is it has stylistic features that other books of the New Testament do not have. Some books of the Old Testament have them. I mentioned Daniel and Zechariah. Ezekiel has them. But most books, even of the Old Testament, don't have them. It's pretty unusual in the Bible to find apocalyptic writings, but it's not unheard of. It's just unusual. But I want to talk about the symbolism that is used in the book of Revelation. First of all, we find, as we read the book, that people, nations, and spiritual beings, like the devil, or like demons, or like Jesus, they're depicted like animals. I mentioned Jesus is depicted as a lamb. The devil is a dragon. There are a swarm of locusts that are almost certainly references to demons, represented as locusts. There's an animal with 7 heads and 10 horns that is said to rule the world. Now, by the way, even the people who say they take the book of Revelation literally do not believe the world will ever be ruled by an animal with 7 heads and 10 horns. They realize, oh, well, that stands for such and such. Well, as soon as you say that stands for such and such, you've said it's not literal. It stands for something that is literal. It is not literal. It is a symbol. And so we see that animals of various kinds are a common image and symbol for things that are not really animals. People, spirits, nations, kingdoms, and so forth. That's one thing. Also, we find that in the book of Revelation, there are 2 women that predominate the picture. One is a bride and the other is a harlot. They are also equated with 2 cities. The harlot is equated with Babylon, the bride with Jerusalem. And these metaphors are mixed in peculiar ways. For example, in Revelation 21, the opening verses, especially verse 2, John says, I saw the heavenly city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, dressed like a bride, adorned for her husband. Now, you almost just have to work with the words and try to avoid images. How do you dress a city like a bride? How do you dress a city in clothing at all? Cities don't dress in clothing. And therefore, we realize that this is all very symbolic. We're talking about what is symbolically called a city, but is also symbolically called a bride. As it turns out, that same entity is referred to as the Lamb's wife. And since the Lamb is symbolic of Jesus, the Lamb's wife must be the bride of Jesus, which would be the church. Therefore, we find that the church is depicted as a woman, a bride, which would be a pure and faithful woman, and also likened to a city, a new Jerusalem. But something or someone is depicted as a harlot, whose name is Mystery Babylon the Great. Now, Babylon revealed in chapter 17 of Revelation is one of those images that there's some explanations given about. But the explanation is not very helpful. The woman is seen riding on a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. An angel says to John, let me explain this to you. The 7 heads on the beast that the woman's sitting on, those are 7 mountains that the woman sits on. There are also 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 now is, and 1 is yet to come. And there's an 8th one, and of the 7. Well, I'm glad that's cleared up. That's one of the few things that's cleared up. And that's as clear as mud. But it goes on to say at the end of that chapter, that woman that you saw riding on the beast is that great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So we need to find out what city is it that John is told is ruling over the kings of the earth. And that is the one that is symbolically called Babylon. You see, the New Jerusalem isn't the literal Jerusalem. The Mystery Babylon isn't the literal Babylon. Nor are either of these cities literal women. These are symbols. The book is full of symbolism. It's cast in symbols from beginning to end. Also, persons and places are given symbolic names. For example, there's a woman in the church of Pergamos, or Thyatira. It's Thyatira, I believe. And she's referred to as Jezebel. Now, of course, there could be a real woman named Jezebel. There was at least once a woman by that name. But the likelihood that the woman in this church is really named Jezebel is not very great. For one thing, it'd be too coincidental. The woman called Jezebel is teaching God's servants to fornicate and to worship idols. Well, that's exactly what Jezebel in the Old Testament did in Israel. It'd be almost too coincidental that we find a woman in the church teaching the same things that Jezebel in the Old Testament taught, and lo and behold, her real name is Jezebel. Not likely. She is called Jezebel because she's like Jezebel, just like John the Baptist is called Elijah because he's like Elijah. Or Jesus in some of the Old Testament prophets is called David because he's like David. Old Testament characters, sometimes their names are taken to describe persons whose real names are not given, but who bear a likeness to them. And so a woman whose name probably was not Jezebel, but who was actually teaching in the church of Thyatira, is referred to as Jezebel. That woman, Jezebel, Jesus says. The city where the Lord was crucified, which we would call Jerusalem, since that's its name, is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt in Revelation 11:8. It says that the 2 witnesses, their bodies after slain, laid in the streets of that great city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. And then John says, where our Lord was crucified. Well, we know where the Lord was crucified, the city of Jerusalem. But it is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. It's symbolic names given to people and places. Obviously, Babylon, as I mentioned, the Mystery Babylon in chapter 17 is not really Mesopotamian Babylon where Nebuchadnezzar ruled, or more recently Saddam Hussein. It's not the place we call Babylon. It is that great city that rules over the kings of the earth and is the harlot, drunk with the blood of martyrs. That's at least what we get from Revelation 17. And so it's not really Babylon. That's a symbolic name. New Jerusalem is a symbolic name. The book is full of symbolic names. Also, you should recognize as symbolic the frequent and recurring references to cosmic and geological disruptions. Things like earthquakes, things like stars falling from the sky, the sun going dark. These images are found fairly commonly in certain parts of the Old Testament when they are actually referring to political upheavals. The fall of, for example, historical Babylon in Isaiah 13:10. When Isaiah is talking about how Babylon will fall to the Medes and Persians, which did happen in 539 BC, it says, the sun will be darkened. The sun will not give its light. The stars will fall from the heavens. This is what Isaiah says happened when Babylon fell in ancient times. Didn't really literally happen. That's just that is itself apocalyptic language. And so in Revelation we see those kinds of phenomena. The heavens roll up like a scroll. And this is early in the story. You know, if it happened at the very end, we might say, well, I guess that's the end of the world. The curtain falls. The scroll is rolled up. The heavens are gone. But it happens in chapter 6. And we have to realize that this kind of language, the readers would have recognized instantly as language of apocalyptic literature. It is not literally the case that stars fall to the earth. How many stars do you suppose could literally fall to the earth? How big are the stars? How many could land on the earth? Wouldn't it be more like the earth would have to fall into a star, and it'd be like a BB falling into, into the ocean? I mean, the stars are so much bigger than the earth. To suggest that literal stars are going to fall to the earth, I just have to, I don't want to, pop your bubble or something. That's not going to happen. No stars are going to fall to the earth. But we find stars falling to the earth. One of them has a key to the bottomless pit. A star with a key to a pit that's bottomless. And it opens the pit, and out come these insects or arachnids or whatever they are. They're said to be like locusts, but they're not very much like locusts, because locusts eat green things, and the locusts that come out of the pit do not touch any green thing. Locusts, according to Proverbs chapter 30, have no king over them. But these locusts have a king over them named Abaddon and Apollyon. These locusts are not a danger to plants, but to people. They have stingers like scorpions. They have faces like men, hair like women. Now don't look at me. I'm not one of them. Although I did know a fellow who styled himself as a Bible teacher back in the 70s, who taught Revelation, and he thought the locusts must be the hippies. Because they have faces like men and hair like women. He was serious. He was an old guy. He knows better now. But the locusts are not real insects. They're not real locusts. That's symbolic. But the thing is, they are released from a bottomless pit by a star that falls to the earth with a key. Now, if you can't recognize that as symbolic, I'm afraid we're not going to get very far together here. That's not literal. The book is full of symbolism. Also, the numbers in the book need to be recognized as symbolic as well. For one thing, the most prominent number in the book, obviously, is the number 7. And you can find many uses of the number 7 in the Old Testament, in places where it's very clear that it is not used as a literal figure in the Old Testament. For example, it says, the righteous man falls 7 times, but the Lord upholds him. Or, 7 times in the night I will arise to praise you. Or many references to 7, which are, I think all Bible scholars, regardless of their view of Revelation, I think all Bible scholars would say the number 7 in Hebrew numerology means completeness, perfection or completeness. So it means something total. Now, therefore, a series of 7 judgments would refer to a total judgment. For Jesus to have 7 eyes means he sees totally everything. He's, in others, omniscient. For him to have 7 horns, an image from the Old Testament, the horn is power. Usually in the figurative language of the Old Testament, a king or a kingdom might have horns, like a ram has horns, or a he-goat in Daniel 8 has a horn. It refers to political power. The horn is the animal's power. David always talks in his songs about how God exalted his horn. He's talking about how God exalted him to power. Now, Jesus has 7 horns, the number 7 meaning completeness. He's got all power. To say the Lamb has 7 eyes and 7 horns is simply an apocalyptic way of saying he's omniscient and omnipotent. The number 7 is not the literal number of eyes that grace the face of Jesus. And he does not have horns on his head, not 7 or any other number. But the number 7 is symbolic for completeness. Now that should tip us off. The number 7 is woven through the fabric of the book of Revelation all the way through. It begins with an announcement that the book is addressed to 7 churches in Asia. Asia, in Revelation, is a reference to the Roman province of Asia, which corresponds in boundaries with our modern country of Turkey. These 7 churches were existing churches, it is true, but there were more than 7 in Turkey. We don't know how many there were, but we know of at least 3 others. Troas is not mentioned in this list. Colossae was in that same region. Hierapolis. Those 3 churches are mentioned elsewhere in Scripture in the same region, Turkey, but they're not mentioned here. Only 7 churches are named. Why? No doubt they are considered to be representative of the whole church, the total church, hence 7 churches. There are 7 spirits of God in Revelation. There are 7 angels of the 7 churches. There are 7 seals on the scroll, which then are broken, and there are 7 trumpets then that are blown. There are 7 thunders in chapter 10. There are 7 vials or bowls of wrath in chapter 16. The number 7 is woven through. In fact, those are the times where it actually mentions that there are 7. That is, those are the occasions where there are 7 trumpets, there are 7 bowls. There's a lot of other 7s in there that the writer doesn't call attention to. For example, there's 7 Beatitudes in the book of Revelation. A Beatitude is a statement that begins with the words, blessed are the, the Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount are the most famous ones. There are 7 such Beatitudes throughout the book of Revelation. And many other 7s in the book. It's a book of 7s. And when you find the number 7, you should not think it's talking about a statistical unit. The numbers of Revelation are not statistical, they are impressionistic. They are conveying ideas. 7 is the symbol for perfection. Now, other numbers are also found recurrent in the book of Revelation. When the 7 trumpets sound, each of them seems to affect 1/3 of some domain. 1/3 of the sea turns to blood. 1/3 of the rivers turn bitter. 1/3 of mankind dies. 1/3 of the city falls. There's a lot of references to the 3rd. Now, 1/3, I believe, I can say with some confidence, although this is not identified for us anywhere in Scripture, I believe 1/3 means a significant minority. It is the largest whole fraction, less than 1/2. And so it's a minority in that it's less than 1/2. But it's a large minority. It's as large a whole number, a whole fraction as you can get under 1/2. So it is a significant minority. In Zechariah chapter 8, I think it's chapter 8, it talks about how God, it might be chapter 3 as a matter of fact, but in Zechariah it talks about how God's going to purge the city of Jerusalem, and 1/3 of them will be spared and 2/3 will be wiped out. It just means a remnant, a significant minority, 1/3 will be preserved. It doesn't mean literally 1/3. Ezekiel was told to shave his head and divide his hair into thirds, and to chop up one of the thirds with a knife, to burn 1/3 with fire and throw 1/3 of it into the wind and let it blow around. He said, these are the things that I'm going to do to Jerusalem. I'm going to kill 1/3 of them with the sword, 1/3 of them are going to be burned with fire, 1/3 of them are going to be dispersed into all the world. These are not neat fractions. This just means there's going to be a significant portion, a minority that would be die by the sword, a significant portion or minority would be scattered. And so in Revelation, the word 3rd, the 3rd should not be thought to be a literal number. I mean, if it was, it would stand out against all the rest of the book of Revelation in that the rest is symbolic. It'd be very strange for that number to be absolutely literal, especially when other places in the Bible it is not. The number 12 is found in some occurrences. There are 24 elders around the throne, obviously twice 12. There's 144,000 persons who receive the mark of God on their forehead before the judgments are poured out in chapter 7, and they're mentioned again in chapter 14. 144,000 is obviously a multiple of 12. It's 12 times 12,000. There in the city of the New Jerusalem, there's 12 foundations with the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb on them. There's 12 gates. The number 12 seems to be the number that signifies God's people, because God's people in the Old Testament were divided into the 12 tribes of Israel. In the New Testament, God's people are represented by the 12 apostles. And so multiples of 12, or simply the number 12, although in the case of the number of apostles, it's the statistical number, the usage of it as a number of foundations to the city no doubt suggests that we're just talking about the people of God, the apostles as a group. The 24 elders before the throne probably just represent God's people, a symbol for God's people. At least that's what most commentators think. And there's not very many things that most commentators agree on. That's one of the few. Now, where this gets rather interesting in the symbolic use of numbers is that there's the famous 1,000 years in Revelation 20. Famous because it is the only reference in the Bible to 1,000 years. The millennium. Some have said that Revelation 20 is the most controversial chapter in the Bible because theologians have divided over the interpretation of that 1,000 years since early times. The early church fathers divided over it. Many of them believed it was a literal 1,000 years. Others did not. And the 1,000 years, what is it? Well, we'll have to decide that when we get to chapter 20. We'll have to take it in its context and see what clues we have. But suffice it to say there's no reason to take it as an exactly literal number. Why would it be literal there when the other numbers are not? And especially when the number 1,000 is not used literally anywhere else in Scripture. In the Psalms, in Deuteronomy, in 2 Peter, in many places the number 1,000 is used, but never literally. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Exactly? 1,000? Not 1,001? No, 1,000 hills. He keeps covenant to 1,000 generations. A day in his sight is as 1,000 years when it is past, and as a watch in the night, Psalm 90 verse 4 says. Peter says, a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. 1,000 years literally? I believe we have to understand here, as Peter certainly intends, that he's not talking a literal 1,000 years corresponding to a literal day. He's saying that 1,000 years, which is a long time to us, is like a day, a short time to God. And the 1,000 years in Revelation, if it is more literal than in the other places in the Bible where it's not literal, that'd be very surprising since Revelation is the most symbolic book in the whole Bible. It'd be strange for no other book in the Bible to use it literally, and yet Revelation is the one that does. I believe it's a mistake to take it literally, but I will not go into the details as to what I believe it refers to right now. Some of you already know what I think, and some of you probably couldn't care less what I think. And that's okay too. But suffice it to say, when we look at the numbers in the book of Revelation, they are not generally statistical. I don't think they ever are. The church of Smyrna is told that they will have tribulation for 10 days. I've never read a commentary that thought that was a literal 10 days. It is said in chapter 17, there are 10 kings that give their authority to the beast for 1 hour. I do not know any commentator that believes that's a literal 60 minutes. These numbers these time designations are impressionistic. An hour means a short time. 10 days means, when it comes to being in jail, it means long enough to be uncomfortable, but short enough to not be a crisis. 1,000 years means a very long time. Many generations in duration. So long you'd stop counting, probably. But the point is, the numbers are symbolic. Now there's also interesting parallelism in Revelation. I won't go into that too much because people disagree as to what degree that is true. Some people think that there are 7 parallel sections. This is particularly the view of those who hold what is usually called the idealist view of Revelation. They say that Revelation is like a Greek drama. It's got 7 acts, and each act is divided into 7 scenes. Well, that's very neat. And it's really almost intuitively correct. Why not? 7 is everywhere in the book. Why wouldn't there be 7 acts, each one divided into 7 scenes? However, it's not really that neat. It is possible and reasonable to divide the book into 7 portions. To call them acts would be okay. I don't have any objection to that. There are definitely 7 natural divisions of the book. Now, dividing those into 7 subsections each, it gets a little trickier. Now, the first section that is usually identified, chapters 1 through 3, is the 7 letters to the 7 churches. That's pretty compact. That's pretty unmistakable. The next section, chapters 4 through 7, is the 7 seals of the book. That's easy to identify too. Then you have the 7 trumpets in chapters 8 through 11. But after that, you've got chapters 12, 13, 14. There's no 7s of anything there.
7 great signs in heaven.
That's what they usually say, 7 great signs. I've tried to count them. I can't find, you have to kind of ignore a few to keep it at 7. There's actually, I don't want to contradict you, but I definitely have read 50 commentaries on Revelation, and they do say that section is 7 signs. And I have tried to discover them without the help of the commentators, and I can't. I have to use the commentators because they're not evident. Let me say this. There may be indeed 7 signs in that particular act. I could not deny it, but I could not affirm it. All I'm saying is it's not as obvious in that one as it is in some of the ones where they're actually numbered, like the 7 bowls of wrath in chapter 16. But, and once you get past chapter 16, there's the identification of 7 this and that is much more difficult, and I've seen it done many different ways by different commentators. I do not object to someone saying the book of Revelation is divided into 7 acts, each having 7 scenes. I would just say that the 7 scenes in some of those cases are going to be a little arbitrary. That would be my judgment call about it. I'm not objecting to it in principle. I'm just saying I cannot establish it from my own research. Now, on this view, many commentators believe, especially the idealist commentators, that these 7 segments, these 7 acts, are parallel to each other. For example, each of them can be found to have a reference in them to the second coming of Christ. And the idealist view, which is not the view I hold, holds that each of these acts is about the whole age of the church. One sees the age of the church through the figure of 7 churches. One through the figure of judgments that through the whole church age are represented as 7 seals being broken. Another sees 7 trumpets, another 7 bowls of wrath, and that these actually are parallel to each other. One of the parallels that is often pointed out, which I find extremely impressive actually, although I don't buy into the scheme entirely, it's rather interesting that as you look at the 7 trumpets, and you look at the 7 bowls of wrath, it's rather interesting on page 4 of your notes, it's in there. The first trumpet and the first bowl both affect the earth. The second trumpet and the second bowl affect the sea. The third trumpet and the third bowl affect the rivers of water. The fourth trumpet and the fourth bowl affect the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and stars. The fifth, and this is even more impressive than any of the others before, the fifth trumpet and the fifth bowl affect the river Euphrates. Now that gets more specific and more, coincidental if it's not intended. And the 7th of each seems to bring us to the end of the world, or the end of the series at least. So that there seems to be some parallelism there. The significance of the parallelism might be questioned, and different people might take different approaches to it. For example, many people feel that since the trumpet judgments affect 1/3 of everything, and the bowl judgments affect the totality of everything, but they affect the same realms, that the trumpets represent a partial judgment in these realms, and the bowl a final and complete judgment. Those are all things that we'll have to consider the merits of when we come to the relevant passages. The only point I'm making is there seem to be some parallels. For example, we find the birth of Jesus in Revelation 12. In other words, we find the beginning of the church age, beginning in chapter 12. It is possible we find the beginning of the church age in chapter 20 as well, so that chapter 12 and chapter 20 would have some degree of overlap or parallel between them. We seem to find the end of the world at the end of chapter 11 and at the end of chapter 19. Now that's disputed in both cases, but the language has led many to believe we've got the second coming of Jesus with the blowing of the 7th trumpet in chapter 11 and with the rider on the white horse in chapter 19. Now Jesus isn't going to come again twice. If these are talking about the second coming of Jesus, it's discussed in 2 different places. And therefore there would be parallel things in the book of Revelation, at least something to consider. Now, Revelation interplays with the rest of the scriptures in a way that is very, it's unique. In that, unlike most New Testament books, the book of Revelation does not quote a single Old Testament scripture. There is no exact quotation of the Old Testament anywhere in the book of Revelation. However, the imagery of the Old Testament is all there is in the book of Revelation. It's like a reworking and rehashing of images and thoughts that are found in Daniel and Ezekiel and Isaiah and the Exodus. And I mean, it's like everything in Revelation is a rehash of something from the Old Testament. There's not so much as a single direct quote. But the degree to which the Old Testament imagery weaves together to make the fabric of what we call the book of Revelation is astonishing. When you see how much Scripture is rewoven together by this author, or by the Holy Spirit, I believe. Those who don't believe it's inspired would have to speculate about how a man could be such a genius as to be able to take hundreds of images from the Old Testament and weave them together into a narrative as amazingly as the book of Revelation has. It's, to my mind, it's frankly one of the evidences to my own subjective judgment that we're dealing with a book that God has revealed and inspired rather than something man put together. If it was put together by man, the book of Revelation is the most astonishing piece of composition of religious literature that probably has ever been written. But, for example, there are the book in the Old Testament that is most frequently alluded to and provides more images than any other for the book of Revelation is actually Isaiah. We usually think of Daniel. When we read Revelation, we think of Daniel being the most like it. Well, Daniel's a lot like it, but Isaiah actually provides more material for Revelation than any other Old Testament book. 79 allusions to things in the book of Isaiah are found in the book of Revelation. Then comes Daniel. 53 allusions to Daniel are in the book of Revelation. Now we're talking about a short book you can read through probably in a half hour. It's got 22 chapters, but they're short. And you can probably read through the book in not much more than a half hour. And yet it's got hundreds of allusions to the Old Testament. 79 from Isaiah, 53 from Daniel, 48 from Ezekiel. By the way, 48 is conservative. I actually was reading an article about Revelation by somebody, I don't remember who it was recently, but he believed the whole book of Revelation is a reworking of the book of Ezekiel. He felt that Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, provides the very framework for the book of Revelation. It was a rather intriguing thesis, but I didn't have time to really analyze it. I was doing something else and just happened to come across it. But the number of allusions to Ezekiel that this author thought were in Revelation was more like 84 rather than 48. The Psalms, 43 times the book of Revelation alludes to something in the Psalms. The book of Exodus, parallels to Exodus exist in Revelation 27 times. 22 times to Jeremiah. 15 times to Zechariah, which is more than one time per chapter of Zechariah. Zechariah is only 14 chapters, yet there are 15 places in Zechariah that are alluded to in the book of Revelation. Amos, 9 times. And the book of Joel, 8 times. Now, if you all total those up, that's a few hundred. So you've got, I didn't do the math, but you can see it just intuitively. You can say that certainly adds up to more than a couple hundred. And so we can see how thoroughly the book of Revelation involves the rest of Scripture. And more than I've already said. We'll talk about it a little more in a moment. But I want to say that while the book of Revelation does not quote from any other part of the Bible and alludes hundreds of times to different parts, it uses images from other parts of the Bible, but it doesn't use them the same way, which is even more creative or just confusing. For example, the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11. We are told that they are the two olive trees that stand in the presence of the Lord. Well, that image, as anyone who knows the Old Testament will recognize, comes from Zechariah chapter 4, where there are two anointed ones who stand before the presence of the Lord. They're called the two olive trees. That's where the book of Revelation gets that phrase, the two olive trees, from Zechariah chapter 4. But in Zechariah 4, generally speaking, scholars believe the two olive trees are Zerubbabel and Joshua, the political and religious leader of the exiles who returned from Babylon in Zechariah's day. In other words, the two olive trees in Zechariah would be, if scholars are generally correct, Zerubbabel and Joshua, men who lived 5.5 centuries before Christ. But that certainly isn't who the two witnesses are. I don't know of any commentators or scholars that would identify the two witnesses in Revelation as Zerubbabel and Joshua. They might identify them as Elijah and Enoch, or Elijah and Moses, or some other two, but I've never heard a single theory that they are Zerubbabel and Joshua, and yet the term, the two olive trees, which is what they're called, refers to those other men in the Old Testament, but the image is picked up and reused, but reapplied. One commentator on the book of Revelation called his commentary a rebirth of images, that Revelation has taken images from the Old Testament and kind of reincarnated them into different settings and different meanings. As I said, that makes it very creative and also very confusing. But it is not as if we can't make sense of it. I'm admitting to you that the book is very confusing, and I certainly would admit that I don't understand everything in it. But I have been working on it for about 43 years, and most of the things in the book of Revelation I think we can make some sense of. There will be some things I'll just have to say, I don't know what they mean, but part of it is because it's such a complex tapestry of biblical images from other parts of the Bible that are now brought together in innovative and new ways. Now, among the ways that the book of Revelation interacts with the rest of Scripture is that it repeats images, especially from the period of the Exodus. Many references in the book of Revelation recall the Exodus. For example, in Revelation 1:5, it says, in the Alexandrian text, it says, Christ freed us by his blood. Now, if you have the King James or the New King James, and by the way, I use the New King James in this study, they follow the Textus Receptus, and it reads differently. In the Textus Receptus, it says he cleansed us or washed us with his blood. In the Alexandrian text, which all the modern translations use, it says he freed us with his blood. Now, it's hard to choose between those two because either of those two could be verified from cross-references. Certainly, to say Jesus washed us by his blood has other references. For example, 1 John chapter 1 and verse 7. The blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all sin. And other places that talk about being washed in the blood. Even later in Revelation, it says they have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. So for Revelation 1:5 to say they have that Christ has washed us in his blood is quite orthodox and fitting. But many manuscripts, the oldest, say he freed us by his blood. And that too presents no theological difficulty at all. But it suggests the image of the Passover. That the blood of the Passover lamb applied to the lintels and the doorposts of the houses of Israel in Egypt freed them from Egypt. That was their deliverance from Pharaoh. It is to say we were freed by his blood would recall Christ our Passover. That's what Paul calls Christ. In 1 Corinthians 5:7, Paul says Christ our Passover has been slain for us. So it's one or the other. Now, if you prefer the oldest manuscripts, the phrase is, he has freed us by his blood, which is a clear allusion back to the Exodus. And it would fit much of the rest of the book of Revelation that echoes the Exodus as well. For example, the persecutor of God's people in Revelation 11:8, which is identified with Jerusalem, is actually spiritually called Egypt. In other words, Jerusalem has become the new Egypt. Israel was originally delivered from Egypt, but now Jerusalem has become the new Egypt, the new persecutor. Spiritually, it's called Egypt. And the dragon who persecutes the woman in Revelation 12:3. That is the image of a dragon is also like Egypt. In Ezekiel 29:3 and Psalm 74:13, Egypt is referred to as the dragon in the sea. Just an image for Egypt that is used in some of the Old Testament passages. And that image of Satan persecuting the woman, it uses the image of a dragon, which would recall to the Jewish reader the image of Egypt persecuting the people. Interestingly, the woman, who is very similar to Israel, I mean, she's got a crown of 12 stars on her head, she's clothed with the sun, she stands in the moon. All those things recall Joseph's dream about the family of Jacob, Joseph's dream about the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing down to him. The woman in Revelation 12 is identified with Israel in some way. The dragon recalls Egypt, although of course the dragon in Revelation is Satan. The imagery recalls Egypt. And the dragon chases the woman into the wilderness. That's what happened in the Exodus. Egypt pursued Israel and they fled into the wilderness. What then? In Revelation 12, God sustains her in the wilderness, just like God sent manna to Israel in the wilderness and sustained them. You see, and even in the wilderness, the earth opens up and swallows a flood that the dragon sends out, just like the earth opened up to swallow up Korah and his rebellion after the Exodus. So there's lots of images here of the Exodus. They're kind of a little esoteric in some cases, but they're really intended. And so we find that the plagues in Revelation, for the most part, are repetitions of the plagues of Egypt. There were 10 plagues in Egypt. Not all of them are repeated in Revelation, but the majority of them are. In Revelation, you find a plague of darkness, a plague of hail, a plague of locusts, a plague of boils, a plague of frogs, a plague of water turning into blood, and so forth. These are echoes and deliberate echoes of the Exodus. We should be cautious about assuming that these are literal events. The book of Revelation is an apocalypse, and it uses symbolism. And to say that, all the oceans turned to blood, and all the fish died, and all the ships of the sea sank, that's pretty striking. And there's many people who say, well, that's going to happen in the end times. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not so sure this is predicting something like that happening in the end times. I'm not sure it's even literal at all. But it is intending to recall the plagues of Egypt, and therefore to make a connection to what is going on in this story to what went on in the Exodus. And we'll of course look at these things individually as we come to them. Those who are saved in Revelation sing the song of Moses. In Revelation 15:3, they sang the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. In Exodus 15, they sang the song of Moses when they came through the Red Sea. In Revelation 15, the saved who seem to be in heaven are singing the song of Moses too. Why? Because their deliverance, which is also the song of the Lamb, parallels that deliverance that was celebrated in the song of Moses in the book of Exodus. And so forth. Also, of course, right after Israel came out of Egypt, God gave instructions for the building of the tabernacle and the furniture of the tabernacle and so forth. And most of that tabernacle furniture reappears in the book of Revelation, up in heaven. You remember when God told Moses how to build the ark and the table to show bread and so forth? That God continually said, make sure that you make everything exactly according to the pattern that I showed you on the mountain. Which sounds as if the tabernacle and its furniture that was made by Moses was patterned after some archetype that God, a transcendent archetype that God showed him, perhaps a heavenly counterpart, that Moses was shown that he was to make an earthly model of in the tabernacle. It's possible that John saw that same heavenly counterpart, because up in heaven, when he's up there, he sees things like the golden lampstand. He sees the Ark of the Covenant. He sees the altar of sacrifice. He sees the Holy of Holies. These things are mentioned throughout the book of Revelation as things that John sees in heaven. Reminiscent certainly of the Exodus, since those things first appear and are described in the Exodus. And so also we find Revelation has these echoes of the Exodus, but also echoes of the Babylonian exile. Not so many, not anywhere near as much. But in the Old Testament, the Babylonian exile resembles the bondage of Egypt. Twice in Israel's history, the whole nation was in bondage in a foreign land away from the promised land. Once in Egypt, once in Babylon. In both cases, God delivered them and brought them back to the promised land. In the Exodus, they escaped from Egypt and eventually ended up in Canaan. In the Babylonian instance, through Cyrus the Persian conquering Babylon, the Jews were allowed to go back and restore their nation again too. Twice God delivered Israel from bondage, in the Exodus and in the return of exiles from Babylon. Both of these events become types. In the Old Testament, they are types of the Messiah's salvation of us. Christ's salvation is a second Exodus. It is a second deliverance from the exile. And in Revelation, we've got the Exodus and the Babylonian exile as milieu informing some of the visions. For example, I mentioned there's Babylon in there. Babylon is the enemy who's drunk with the blood of martyrs. And many times in Revelation we are told Babylon is fallen, is fallen. Well, that's exactly what happened when God delivered Israel from Babylon. Jeremiah chapter 51 talks about how Babylon is fallen. In fact, the line comes from Jeremiah, and predicting that God would cause Babylon to fall to the Medes and the Persians, which would result in Israel being delivered. It's like a second Exodus, this time from Babylon. And that imagery of that historical second Exodus is now brought up alongside echoes of the original Exodus. Now we have Babylon falling again. Interestingly, in Revelation 16, one of the things that happens when the bowls are poured out is the rivers of the Euphrates dried up to make way for the kings of the east. Now, if you read popular commentaries on Revelation, it is often said that this is something going to happen in the tribulation period. The kings of the east, they say, are China. You've probably heard this if you've been around. The Chinese army, numbering 200 million men, is going to march into the Battle of Armageddon. For that purpose, God is going to dry up the river Euphrates. I believe it was Hal Lindsey who said, you know, the Russians have built a dam up at the top of the river Euphrates, so it can happen. They can dam up the river Euphrates, then the Chinese armies can march across, and Revelation says the river Euphrates dried up to make way for the kings of the east to come. Marvelous. But has it occurred to anybody that we no longer live in a time when rivers pose any obstacle to armies? You don't need to dry up rivers to invade a country. Most of the time you come by air. Or you don't come at all, you just send your missiles on ahead. Drying up rivers was what had to be done for ancient armies, not for modern armies. The river Euphrates would not, it being dried up would not make a lick of difference for a Chinese force to invade Israel. They don't need to dry up the river Euphrates. The river wouldn't slow them down a second. To suggest that this is predicting that, to my mind, is silly, if I might be rude. But to recognize that the drying up of the river Euphrates for the kings of the east to come in is an echo of the fall of Babylon in the Old Testament is sensible. Since the fall of Babylon is repeatedly mentioned in the book of Revelation, the fact that the river Euphrates is dried up to make way for the kings of the east reminds us of how Babylon historically fell. Cyrus, the king of Persia from the east, brought his armies against Babylon and could not invade it except under the walls where the river Euphrates ran. So he rerouted the river, dried up the river Euphrates, and marched his armies, the kings of the east, under the wall and conquered Babylon. Thus Babylon fell. The language of Revelation is reminiscent of the fall of Babylon. Because why? Because that was like another Exodus. That's like the judgment of Egypt, by which Israel escaped Egypt and went to the land. So the fall of Babylon was another instance of the same phenomenon. God delivers Israel so they can go back to their land. These are the images that make up the milieu of the book of Revelation. Of course, it's not talking about those events. It's talking about something else, something after John's time that in principle is like those things. Obviously, the book of Revelation is talking about some kind of salvation, some kind of divine deliverance, some kind of judgment on the enemies of God's people so that God's people are freed to be the true Israel of God. This is whatever Revelation's about, it's something like that. That is a lot like these other events that are echoed in its imagery. Okay? Now, you know, another interesting historical setting that is echoed in one place in Revelation is the life and ministry of Jesus. And that is in the story of the two witnesses. I believe the two witnesses are symbolic, although I have met the literal two witnesses many times. In 43 years, as much as I travel, you can't help but meet the two witnesses here and there. I was picked up by two hitchhikers once that informed me they were the two witnesses. They were hippies. I think they'd been smoking dope, and they'd read the book of Revelation. And it was revealed to them that they were the two witnesses. I've had others. Recently, Enoch wrote to me. No, it was Elijah, excuse me. Emailed me. In all sobriety, he said he was soon going to meet up with Enoch, and they were going to go to Jerusalem, and they were the two witnesses. You know, not all Christians are sane. And if you circulate in as many Christian circles as I do, you'll run into the two witnesses. However, in my opinion, the two witnesses are not literally two people. The two witnesses are symbolic, like many other things in the book of Revelation are. And the imagery by which they're symbolically depicted is deliberately borrowed from the imagery, from the actual historical life of Christ. Just like some of the images of plagues are borrowed from the historical Exodus, or the historical fall of Babylon is alluded to, so the historical life of Jesus provides the pattern for the symbolic description of the two witnesses. They minister for 3.5 years, like Jesus. Their ministry is miraculous, like Jesus. They're persecuted at the end of time, like Jesus, and put to death, like Jesus, in the town where Jesus was. The city where Jesus was crucified, we're specifically told in chapter 11, verse 8. Then they're dead for 3 days, and then they get up again and ascend into heaven, like Jesus. Now, I don't believe those events literally are to happen with some group of witnesses in the future. Forgive me if you disagree, but my own studies of the book of Revelation have convinced me that this too, like the rest of the book, is very symbolic. But what I can recognize is the two witnesses, whoever they represent, and I do have a pretty firm opinion about that, which you'll have to wait till chapter 11 to find out about. But the two witnesses are likened to Jesus, obviously. And the imagery of the 3.5-year ministry, the death, the resurrection, the ascension after 3 days, these images are borrowed from the actual historical life of Christ and applied symbolically to the career of whoever the two witnesses may be. Now, I'm not going to keep you all night. Maybe. We will not finish our notes tonight. I'm not going quickly enough. But we are going to, in the course of this introduction, before we actually start going through chapter 1, 2, and 3, and so forth, we're going to talk about the 4 views of Revelation. The 4 approaches. You might be aware that some years ago I wrote a book that's called Revelation 4 Views. In that book, I do not reveal my preferred view. I simply present 4 views side by side, as objectively as I know how, and judging from the Amazon.com reviews, it sounds like most people feel that I have succeeded in concealing my own view pretty well. Not perfectly. You can certainly tell from reading my book which view I don't believe is correct. But which view I do believe is correct is not that easy to discern, because my own view is kind of a mixture. But the truth is, there are 4 distinct approaches, and I come to the book of Revelation without a preference about it, but as objectively as a person can. I don't have anything at stake. Now, if I had written a book about Revelation defending one of the views, I'd have pressure to defend that view. I actually thought, after I wrote the book, I thought maybe I'll write an appendix saying what I believe. I thought, nah, better not do that. After all, I've changed my view 3 times in my teaching career. What if I do again? You know, I don't want to go on record as believing a certain thing and then change my view and wish I'd never published. I've often thought, what if Hal Lindsey would change his mind today? 40 million people have read his view. He's made fun of every other view than his own. Insisted that it's correct. Written book after book. Made millions of dollars on it. And then imagine he began to think, wait a minute. Maybe this one isn't right. Nah. Can't even entertain those thoughts. I'd rather remain free to think and therefore not go on record, at least in print, about my view. But I'll tell you what my view is when we teach through. But the point is, I really don't have dog in this race. It's not like I have some commitment or agenda to defend a particular view. But I have reached conclusions that convince me, and yet I want people to know what all the views are and why they are believed. I want to actually give you the strengths of each view for you to assess, and what I consider to be the drawbacks of each view for you to assess. And then you can make up your own mind. And that's what we will do in the course of this introduction before we're done. But it'll be in our next session tomorrow night that we will actually survey those views and actually weigh the strengths and weaknesses of each view. Tonight I want to say that one of the views, at least, is that Revelation is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That view is called the preterist view. That's only one of the four, but it is one of the views. Now, the reason I say that is because we have to consider the date that Revelation was written. And most modern commentators, most modern study Bibles, if they give introductions to the book of Revelation, they say Revelation was written near the end of the reign of Domitian, around 96 AD. That is the majority view among scholars these days, that Revelation was written about 96 AD. Now, it takes only a moment's reflection to realize that this rules out at least one of the four views of Revelation. The one that says Revelation was writing, predicting the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. How could it be that an author writing 25 years after that event would write a book predicting it? Of course, one might say, well, it's written after the event, pretending to be written before, but that's not, that book doesn't belong in the Bible then, okay? I believe Revelation is a genuine prophecy predicting something. Therefore, it must have been written before that something. Now, if it was AD 70, then the book would have to be written before AD 70. And therefore, the popular view that Revelation was written in 96 AD would rule out the preterist view, and it would leave the other views still standing. In fact, the other three views really are not vulnerable on the matter of the date. The book of Revelation could be written in the year 50 AD or the year 100 AD, and it would make no impact on the futurist view, the historicist view, or the idealist view. Those views are, the date of writing is irrelevant to them. But to the preterist view, the date of writing is all important. Because whatever the view may have in its favor, it has one fatal flaw. If the book was written after 70 AD, the view goes down the toilet. It doesn't belong even under consideration. It requires a pre-70 AD date. Now, I said the majority of scholars today believe that the book was written in 96 AD, but not all scholars. There are excellent scholars of the highest rank who also hold that the book was written in the reign of Nero. Nero was, he committed suicide in 68 AD, so if it was written during his reign, it was written in or before 68 BC, which places it before 70. So the preterist view has a vested interest in an early date, a Neronian date. The idea that Nero was the emperor at the time of writing is very important to somebody who believes that the preterist view is correct. Now, without talking about the merits of the preterist view or other views at this time, and we'll save that for another lecture, let me talk about the evidence for when the date was of the writing. And while I would say, as I did, that the majority of modern scholars think the later date, 96, the reign of Domitian, is the correct date, in the 19th century, the majority of evangelical scholars thought it was written during the reign of Nero. The opinion has shifted, but not because of new evidence. It's just that new arguments become popular, and the scholarly world shifts its favorite views from time to time just because some favorite son of the academy has written a theory that sounds good, and they follow that for a while. Almost all scholars, and I say this as one who's read 50 commentaries on Revelation and can see the trends, almost all scholars are lemmings. A few are not. A few scholars are innovative. A few scholars think for themselves and outside the box. And every once in a while, a scholar comes up with a new idea that everyone else isn't saying. And if it's clever enough, then the lemmings all start following him. And follow him for maybe decades, maybe centuries. And then another thinking scholar arises. And the lemmings all follow him. And so you have to realize that just because the majority of scholars think any given thing, it's not an argument for it being true. It's an argument for it being the current vogue, the current academic fad. Now, academic fads can be valid or not. That's why they shift as new arguments arise. So, just so we'll put this in perspective, in the 1900s, most evangelical scholars thought the book was written in the reign of Nero, the earlier date. In the 20th century, I said the 1900s, in the 1800s, the 19th century, that was the main view. The 20th century, most shifted to believe it was in the reign of Domitian. But why? What are the evidences? Now that's what I want to talk about in the remaining few minutes I have. What evidence is there to point to one date or another? Now there are evidences for both. It's not like it's a slam dunk for one or the other date. What we really have is a tension between the weight of external evidence on the one hand and the weight of internal evidence on the other. Now what I mean by that, when scholars talk about a book of the Bible, and let's say its authorship or its date or some objective data about a book, they say there's internal evidence and external evidence. What they mean is, inside the book there are statements that give us clues that might help us answer the question. That's internal evidence. The author himself is giving us the data. But there's also external evidence, which means what the early church thought about it. What was their opinion? What did Tertullian think? What did Irenaeus think? What did Justin Martyr think? What did Hippolytus think? What did the early church think? The testimony of the early church, the first people to actually possess the book from the hands of the author, who did they think wrote it? You'd think they would know. After all, they received it from them. Unless it came in a plain brown package by post without a return address, they would probably know where they got it from, who wrote it. And therefore, the testimony of church fathers is also considerable evidence, but it's external. The church fathers were not inside the book, they're outside the book, so their testimony is evidence as external to the book itself. Internal evidence is drawn from what's in the book itself. Now, evangelicals, I think, should be committed to the belief that internal evidence should trump external evidence. Why? Because the book's inspired. Whatever the book itself tells us should be more important than what anyone outside the book may have thought about it. The opinions of any group of men are not as authoritative as God's own testimony. And therefore, the internal evidence for a biblical book weighs more than external evidence. Now, I'm going to give you details, but just to summarize it, in general, the internal evidence of Revelation, I believe, supports the early date. The external evidence seems to support the later date. So the scholarly vogues about which is the better date depend very largely on what do we prefer, internal or external evidence. That is to say, I think the evidence within the book would, in general, on balance, point to a date during the writing during the reign of Nero. But the testimony of the church fathers generally place it in the reign of Domitian, 25 or so years later. Now, those who take the late date also point to internal evidence. But to my mind, it's all very weak. They've got a pretty strong case, external evidence, for the late date. But the internal evidence they point to for the late date is not very strong, in my opinion. Let's look at it. First of all, what evidence is there for a date during during the time of Nero? Among those scholars who are alive today, or who have been alive in recent times and are highly recognized as authoritative, who hold the early date, would include J. Adams, Adam Clark's commentaries, not exactly contemporary. Alfred Edersheim was about a century ago, although Alfred Edersheim was a Jewish Christian living in Palestine who wrote the Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah and an equally large volume on the Old Testament history. Pretty respected scholar. J.B. Lightfoot, John A.T. Robinson's, Philip Schaff, the great church historian from Switzerland, and many others have held or do hold to the early date. A very long list can be given. Most of the names I did not include because you wouldn't have heard of them. I'm not sure you've heard of the ones I gave, but I have. Some of the names on the list I don't know much about. But these are reputable scholars of high rank, and they are convinced of the early date. Now you can also find a long list of scholars who believe the late date. We're not going to count noses here. I just want you to know there are reputable scholars today who believe both views. What arguments can be given for the early date? One is chapter 17, verses 9 and 10. Revelation 17, verses 9 and 10. I made reference to this before, and it is indeed an obscure statement, possible of being interpreted more than one way. That is, there's more than one option in interpreting this statement. But in Revelation 17, verses 9 and 10, when the beast that the woman is riding on is being described by the angel, it says, "Here is a mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time, and the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition." This is that passage I quoted saying that's the clarifying of the vision. It's obviously very obscure. But the reference to 7 kings has often been seized upon as a help to knowing when the book was written, because it says 5 kings have fallen, 1 now is. Now, on the assumption, and a great number of scholars assume that John means by kings, emperors. John wrote this during the Roman Empire's ascendancy, and so they say he's talking about Roman emperors. 5 Roman emperors had fallen at the time he was writing, but at the time he was writing, the 6th Roman emperor was seated, was reigning. Nero was the 6th of the Roman emperors. And so some feel that John is telling us here that he was writing during the reign of Nero. Now, it'd be nice if that was a slam dunk. It is not. One of the problems with it is it's assuming that the kings are emperors. In fact, in Daniel, kings are empires. And John may be using it the same way. He may be saying not 5 emperors, but maybe 5 empires have risen and fallen. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Media Persia, Greece, Rome. Rome's the 6th. So this becomes ambiguous evidence. But on the assumption that he's talking about emperors, he would be identifying Nero as the sitting emperor at the time. What else do we have? Chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. "Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood, saying, 'Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar and the house of worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Now, what is going on here is he's told to measure a portion of the temple. The actual word temple there in the Greek is naos. It's the Greek word for the Holy of Holies. He's supposed to measure the Holy of Holies. But the rest of the temple he's not supposed to measure. Why? Well, he's told the rest of the temple is given to the Gentiles. They're going to tread it underfoot. Now, that would suggest the part of the temple he's measuring is to be preserved, inviolate. But the rest of the temple is going to be given over to the Gentiles, strongly suggesting that the temple is going to be, at least the outward temple, is going to be trampled underfoot, going to be destroyed. It sounds as if the temple here is still standing, and he's measuring it. If the temple indeed was still standing when he wrote this, it was before 70 AD, because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And this seems to be predicting the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. It may be saying something else, and therefore people don't all agree on the importance of this particular information. To my mind, this is pretty important because it does sound like the temple's still standing at the time he's writing, so that he can go and measure it and so forth. Though, of course, the thing did happen in a vision. And a vision may include features that are not historically contemporary, and therefore it doesn't prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that the temple is really standing at the time. But it does give that impression. To my mind, that's the first impression we receive. It is not something that cannot be challenged. Then we have the situation between the church and the Jewish community. Two of the churches that are mentioned, the Church of Smyrna and the Church of Philadelphia, seem to be persecuted by the Jewish population in their town. Jesus speaks to them to encourage the church that he knows these Jews who claim they're Jews. He said they're not really Jews, they're really the synagogue of Satan. But he said he's going to humble them. He's going to make them come bowing to them and acknowledging that he loves them. But the point here is that these churches, these Christians, are being persecuted by Jews. Though this is not a solid proof, there is serious doubt that the Jewish community would be of a mind to persecute anybody after their temple had been destroyed, after their commonwealth had been judged. When they've been scattered like sheep throughout the empire, they would be, of course, existing in the cities where the church was, but greatly demoralized, one would think. Not really that cocky, not in a position to feel their oats to the point where they feel like they can pick on another group of people in town. It seems, although this is not proof positive, it seems like the Jewish people in those towns are not in the mood one would expect them to be if the temple had been destroyed and their nation had been humiliated and judged. They seem to be a little too self-confident and considering themselves to be more or less in power. Now, maybe the most interesting evidence is the number 666, which of course everybody speculates about. In the final verse of chapter 13, it says in verse 18, "Here is wisdom, let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. For it is the number of a man, his number is 666. And all scholars have pretty much agreed that this is referring to the numeric equivalent of the letters of the man's name. The names, as I'm sure most of you know, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin are all languages where the letters of the alphabet double for numerals. So that we're very familiar with that. In Latin, we have the Roman numeral system. X is 10, V is 5, and so forth. It's the Roman alphabet, also is numbers. Same is true in Greek and Hebrew. That means that any word and any name in these languages could be, you could add up the numerical value of the letters in it and total it up. And this, in fact, was done from time to time, popularly. Scholars have found graffiti from ancient Rome where somebody said 387 is in love with 294. And it's like they've taken their names and they've given numerical equivalents to make them rather difficult to decipher. And so John says, this number of the beast is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, most Christians, and it doesn't matter what their view of Revelation is, this is true of almost all of them, believe that this is somebody's name. Now, it's interesting that John felt that the wise among his original readers could figure out who it was, which means it was someone then living, not someone who's going to be born 2,000 years later. How could John possibly hope for even the wisest among them to calculate the name of the beast if he wasn't going to be born for another 2,000 years? He's writing to people who are really alive at the time and saying, those among you who have wisdom, figure this out. I think you can do it. Calculate the number of the beast and you'll know who I'm talking about. His number is 666. Obviously a contemporary person in John's day. But who? Well, if we, don't restrict it to people in John's day, all kinds of suggestions come up. People thought it was Mussolini, some thought it was Henry Kissinger, some people thought it was Ronald Reagan, some people have all different ideas about who it is. Some people think it's King Ferdinand of Spain, and all kinds of ideas have been floated. and innovative ways of calculating the number 666 from their actual name. Like Ronald Reagan, I don't remember what his middle name is, but all his first, middle, and last name all have 6 letters. Wilson, okay. Ronald Wilson Reagan, 666. I actually heard people suggest that. Well, first of all, 666 isn't what it is. It's 666. Only in English letters does that look like 666. The number 666 is what it is. It's not 3 sixes. But anyway, it has been pointed out by those who hold to the early date that Caesar Nero, his name translated into Hebrew, and the letters value calculated comes out to 666. Now, of course, that may be true of many people, but it's not true of very many people who are candidates for emperor in the time of the writing of Revelation. It's not true, for example, of Domitian, or of any other emperor, or of any other known figure from that period that can easily be identified. Irenaeus, who lived in a century following, believed that the word meant Latinus, which he said, the word Latinus means the Roman. And he thought, since the word Latinus totals up to 666, he thought that was a good guess. But it's not the number of a nationality, it's the number of a man. And the only known man whose name can be calculated that way in that period would be Caesar Nero. Now someone might say, but wait, you said in Hebrew. Why in the world would we have to transfer his name into Hebrew to get the number? Well, the argument goes, the purpose for giving his name in symbolism is so the Romans, if they happen to find the book, would not recognize that it's a reference to the emperor, and not a very flattering one at that. And therefore, since the Romans would know Greek and Latin, using those languages would not be safe. Using Hebrew would be. The Romans would hardly know Hebrew. And so, yet the readers would perhaps know it. There are Hebrew words in the book of Revelation. Though it's written in Greek, it's got a number of Hebrew words. Armageddon is a Hebrew word. Alleluia is a Hebrew word. The angel of the bottomless pit, his name is given in Greek and in Hebrew. Apollyon, and the other one. Abaddon. And so Apollyon, of course, is Greek, but Abaddon is Hebrew. Same word in both languages. So the readers are expected to know something of Hebrew, but the outsiders in the Roman Empire might not be expected to, and therefore Caesar Nero becomes an interesting, some would say a convincing candidate for it to be the number 666. So these suggestions are internal evidence that point that direction. They don't prove it, but they can be seen to suggest it, although every one of those evidences could be interpreted differently. But this is true also of the evidences for a late date. Only the ones for a late date, the internal evidences are weak in the extreme. For example, those who believe in the late days say, well, chapter 13 describes emperor worship, and emperor worship wasn't really an issue until the time of Domitian. Therefore, it must have been written during the time of Domitian because it describes emperor worship. Well, this might be an interesting argument if we don't believe in predictive prophecy. In other words, if John can only write about things that are already happening in his time, then maybe so. On the other hand, if he can prophesy, he might even write about the time of Domitian decades before the time of Domitian. It's not impossible. Isaiah wrote about Cyrus and even named him 200 years before the man did the things predicted, 150 years before he was born. John could predict things that happened in the reign of Domitian if he wished, without him living in that time. Even if we agreed, and I do not, that Revelation 13 is describing Domitian's persecution of the Christians and requiring people to worship him, that would tell us nothing about when it was written, unless we rule out predictive prophecy as a possibility. Because in the reign of Nero, a prophet could predict things in the reign of Domitian, so it wouldn't tell us anything about what it was written. Likewise, the extent of the persecution. They say, in the reign of Nero, the persecution didn't extend that far. Nero just persecuted Christians in Rome, but these Christians were in Asia Minor. Only Domitian had an empire-wide persecution, so it must be the reign of Domitian. Well, again, not a strong argument, since the book of Revelation doesn't make any reference to an empire-wide persecution. The 7 churches are not told that they were subjected to an empire-wide persecution. The Smyrna and Philadelphia were subjected to persecution from the Jewish community in their towns. The church of Pergamum seemed to be persecuted by the local Roman authorities in the town. Several of the churches didn't seem to be persecuted at all. There's no evidence in Revelation that there was an empire-wide persecution going on, so even if it's true that Domitian was first to bring about one, it's irrelevant. The book of Revelation does not discuss one. Okay? How about this? The Nero redivivus myth. What is that? It is known that among the Roman people after Nero died, a myth, a rumor circulated that Nero wasn't really dead. He was very much hated and feared by the Romans, and they could hardly believe he was dead. It was almost too good to be true. So many of them said, sort of like they said about John F. Kennedy, he's not really dead. They're keeping him on ice. He's going to come back and be the beast. He had a mortal head wound, but it's going to be healed. Maybe you never heard that stuff. If so, you weren't talking to people about Bible prophecy in the late 60s. But that's what they said about Nero. He's not really dead. He's going to come back. And we'll all be in trouble. And you see, the beast in Revelation has a head wound, a mortal head wound, that heals. And many people say, well, what that means is the beast was assassinated or killed, but in the imagery of the Revelation, he comes back. And this is the most amazingly, I was going to say inane, but I don't want to be too insulting. Stupid. This is the most amazingly stupid argument I can imagine an evangelical giving. Now, if a person is not evangelical, they can come up with any arguments they want. But a person who believes in the inspiration of Scripture, what they say is the Revelation and talking about the head wound of the beast that's healed is alluding to the Nero redivivus myth, that is the myth that was circulating in Rome that Nero was going to come back from the dead. Huh? And then they say Domitian was referred to by the Latin poets as the second Nero, or sometimes the bald Nero. But the point is that when Domitian came along, he was enough like Nero that people likened him to Nero. And so they're saying, you see, the beast is Domitian, and he's likened to Nero, who's died and is now back, according to the mythology of the Romans. Then are we being told that John is affirming this mythology? That John is affirming that Domitian is in fact a return of Nero from the dead? If not, then the argument makes no sense at all. I don't think so. In fact, in Revelation, the beast never dies. He has a mortal head wound in one of his 7 heads. The other 6 are perfectly healthy. If you have 7 heads and one of them dies, that doesn't kill you, unless infection sets in. But the truth is, the beast lived on. It specifically says the beast had a mortal head wound, but lived on. It didn't die. There's no assassination of a man who dies and then comes back. That's the Left Behind novels that have that. That's dispensational fairy tales, frankly, that say that there's going to be a world dictator who's going to be assassinated and going to come back. That Revelation doesn't say anything like that. There's no mention of the beast dying or coming back. It's just that the beast survives, despite one of his 7 heads being killed. Now, what that means, we'll have to discuss another time. But it certainly doesn't mean that John is referring to the Nero redivivus myth as if he's referring to Domitian and the popular notion that Domitian was a second Nero. I'm not going there. I'm not going to buy that. But here's probably the argument that is given most often. I realize I've gone later than I wanted to, but I'm in the middle of something. If you have to leave, go. But they say the state of the 7 churches as witnessed in the 7 letters to the 7 churches is not that which would fit the time of Nero. It seems that that was later. Why? There's a couple of things they say. They say, first of all, the church of the wealth of Laodicea. Laodicea says, I have need of nothing, I'm rich, I'm powerful, and so forth. And they say, just a few years before 70 AD, there was a devastating earthquake that we know devastated the city of Laodicea. The city was almost leveled to the ground. And it was like in the early 60s. So just before 70 AD, the city would not have recovered to the point to be talking about being wealthy. Well, how do we know that? I mean, if the city was destroyed in 63 AD, who's to say it wasn't sufficiently rebuilt for people to be talking about their wealth again by, say, 67 or 68, 5 years later? Maybe the city wasn't rebuilt. Revelation doesn't say the city was fully rebuilt. It just says the attitude of the people is that they are wealthy and have need of nothing. It might even be not talking about physical wealth. They might be thinking about their spiritual wealth. They might be boasting about their spirituality. It's hard to know. But in any case, the argument doesn't prove anything. But then we have the interesting argument that the church of Smyrna, which is addressed in the second letter in Revelation 2, didn't exist in the time of Paul. Now, Paul died probably around 67 AD. And therefore, they say if the church of Smyrna did not exist in the time of Paul, that means it didn't exist in 67 AD. It could hardly be thought to become a church in the next couple of years and have received a letter like this. Well, first of all, I'd say that doesn't make sense. What if that is even true, that the church didn't exist till 67 AD? Couldn't it come into existence in 68 AD or 69 and still be before 70 AD? It seems like 68 and 69 are still years before 70 AD and are years as good as any other for the church to come into existence. But the very suggestion that the church of Smyrna didn't exist in the time of Paul is a misnomer. It's based on a misreading of the letter of Polycarp to the church of Philippi. Polycarp, who was later a bishop of Smyrna, this very church. In the early 2nd century, Polycarp was the bishop of the church of Smyrna. And he wrote a letter at that time to the Philippian church, the same church Paul had written Philippians to. But of course, much, much later, Polycarp's writing to them. And when Polycarp writes to the church of Philippi, he says this to them. He said, "Among you, the blessed Paul labored, who are praised in the beginning of his epistle," meaning the epistle to the Philippians that we have in our Bible. "For concerning you, he boasts in all the churches, who then alone had known the Lord, for we had not yet known him." We, presumably meaning the church of Smyrna, had not yet known the Lord, meaning presumably the gospel had not yet come to Smyrna, and the people of Smyrna didn't know Jesus yet. When? In the lifetime of Paul? That's not what he says. When Paul wrote to the Philippians. That was not at the end of Paul's life, it was near the end, but Paul wrote to the Philippians when he came to Rome after 60 AD. Could have been 61, 62 AD, we don't know the exact date, but in all likelihood it was in the early 60s that Paul wrote the letter to the Philippians. That is the time when Polycarp says the church of Smyrna did not yet exist, when Paul wrote to the Philippians. That's the time he's talking about, not Paul's lifetime as a whole, but when Paul wrote to the Philippians, we did not yet know the Lord, he says. But certainly that gives almost a decade for the church to come into existence before Revelation. But a church doesn't need a decade to come into existence in order to exist, by the way. Now, there's another thing too, and that is that the letters to the churches testify to a spiritual decline in some of the churches. Ephesus had left their first love. Sardis had a name that it lived but was now dead. And of course, Laodicea was blind, naked, pitiful, miserable, poor. That is backslidden. It was lukewarm, basically. Laodicea was lukewarm. So we got Ephesus has left their first love. Laodicea has gone lukewarm. And Sardis has lost any real life. It only has a reputation for life. They say that takes some time for churches to get that bad. And these churches were founded during Paul's second missionary journey when he was in Asia, which was in the late 50s. So they say 10 years isn't, which if Revelation was written to them before 70 AD, we're talking about maybe only within 10 years after they were founded. 10 years is not long enough for a church to go lukewarm. Everyone's laughing. Why? Because that's a stupid argument. How long does it take a church to go lukewarm? Depends. 15 minutes? How long did it take the Galatian churches to depart from the gospel and embrace a different gospel? Paul had barely left town. Paul walked away from Galatia and got back home to Antioch and had to write to the Galatians that they'd left the faith. and had fallen from grace. And he'd just been there weeks earlier. He founded the church and came home, and they were already gone. What about the Corinthian church? Well, within Paul's lifetime, they were denying the resurrection of the dead. They were allowing people to live in incest. I mean, how long does it take for a church to go bad? Depends on the church. I've seen them go bad faster than 10 years, I'll tell you that. I've seen a whole revival go bad in 3 or 4 years. So, I mean, this argument that the churches, they've gone lukewarm, some of them. It can't happen within 10 years, so must not be an early date of writing. The argument makes no sense to me. But I'll give you the last argument, and then we'll be done. I'll release you. I do believe I've gone too long, but I can't stop now. These internal evidences of the late date are not, to my mind, convincing or valid at all. Now, I realize the internal evidences for the early date are not compelling, but they are better. The internal evidence for the early date, to my mind, is better than the internal evidence for the late date. But the real strong evidence for the late date is the external evidence, and that is the testimony of Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John. John wrote the book of Revelation. Irenaeus was removed from the author of Revelation by only one generation, or two, depending on how you figure it. Polycarp, Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus said something that has become the basis of the belief that John wrote this during the reign of Domitian. And Irenaeus' words are given here in your notes at the bottom of page 5. This is what he said, and this is the basis for the late date of Revelation being championed. Here's what Irenaeus said. He's talking about the subject of the mark of the beast. Okay, that's the subject he's writing about. He says, now since this is so, and since this number, 666, is found in all the good and ancient copies, that is, the good and ancient copies of Revelation, and since those who have seen John face to face testify, and reason teaches us that the number of the name of the beast appears according to the numeration of the Greeks by the letters in it, his assumption, we will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in the present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, meaning John. For that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, toward the end of Domitian's reign. Now you see, that statement, that was seen almost in our own day, not so long ago, in the end of Domitian's reign. What was seen? Well, in the previous sentence, it talks about him who saw the heavenly vision. That was seen in the reign of Domitian. What was seen? The vision or the guy who saw it? Notice earlier in the paragraph he says, those who saw John testify. There is reference to John being seen, but there's also reference to John seeing the heavenly vision. And there's ambiguity in the statement, that was seen. What that? John or the vision? Now, almost all scholars who take the late date, in fact all of them, believe it is saying that John saw the vision on Island Patmos during the late reign of Domitian. However, good arguments can be raised against that meaning of Irenaeus' words. First of all, Irenaeus said that Domitian's reign was not very long before his time, almost in his own day, in his opinion. Yet he speaks of very ancient copies of the book of Revelation. The good and ancient copies of the book all testify to this number 666. Wait a minute. If it was written in the reign of Domitian, which you're saying was almost in your own day, not very long ago, how could there be ancient copies? Presumably the originals are more ancient than the copies. How could many of the copies of the book, already a second generation of the book, is now also ancient? Now, it certainly sounds like he's saying the book is old, but Domitian's reign was not so long ago. This would argue more that he's saying John was seen during the reign of Domitian. That is, the last time anyone saw him or talked to him was that recently, but not telling us when he saw the vision. The book, after all, is very ancient and has ancient even copies of the original. So it sounds like he's not
saying that the book of Revelation was written or the visions seen in the reign of Domitian, but John was. Not all would agree with this. Of course, this is a great debate. But the argument he's making is we do not have to speculate about who the Antichrist is. Why? Because, first of all, the name is not given in any of the copies of the book. Secondly, many people have seen John, and he didn't tell them the name. And if it was important for us to know, he would have told us. In other words, the emphasis is on the fact that some people have seen John, and he said nothing about it. And for him to say, for that was seen not so very long ago, meaning that man was seen not very long ago in the reign of Domitian, would say, you know, there are people I know, or people you know, who knew people who saw John. And they say he never said anything about this. Never told us the name. Now, I'm not saying that the way I've just described Irenaeus' words are the necessary way to understand them, but they are an alternative way to understand them. It seems to me not unreasonable to suggest that Irenaeus is saying that John was last seen alive in the reign of Domitian, but does not tell us when John was on Patmos or when he saw the vision, but suggests that in his day the book was very ancient. Even the copies of the book were ancient, and the copies would come up, would be the second generation of the book. Now, let's say this. Suppose Irenaeus actually did mean that the book of Revelation was written during the reign of Domitian. How much can we trust Irenaeus? Hard to say. He also said that Jesus lived to be about 50 years old before he was crucified. That was something Irenaeus says. Jesus lived to be about 50. There's not a living scholar I've ever encountered that would think that Irenaeus was right about that. The evidence of Scripture is that Jesus lived to be only in his 30s, not 50. So Irenaeus might not be the most reliable witness on historical data anyway. So even if he did say that John saw the vision in the reign of Domitian, he could be wrong about that, as he is about some other things more fundamental, like Jesus. So the external evidence from Irenaeus, which by the way was quoted and followed by later church fathers as if it was valid, later church fathers also said Domitian was the emperor at the time, but seemingly followed Irenaeus on this. They may have misunderstood him, or they may have understood him and he was wrong, or he might be right. But the point is, it's merely a man's statement as opposed to the internal evidence of the book, which, to my mind, the temple seems to be standing. The man 666, the best candidate I know is Nero. There may be a better one that we don't know about. But we have to leave the matter undecided about the date. And that's okay with me. I don't really care if we can settle the question or not. The main thing is, if the question is unsettled, then the preterist view remains still a possibility. If the matter is settled in favor of the late date, then preterism can't be considered a possibility. If the late date is proved, or even still in the running, then preterism is a possibility and should be considered alongside other views. I personally lean toward preterism in most parts of the book of Revelation. I'm not fully preterist in the book of Revelation. I have some parts I don't take the preterist view, but for the most part, I lean toward that. I do believe the main theme of the book of Revelation is going to be the fall of Jerusalem. And I believe, therefore, the book was written before 70 AD. I can't prove it, nor do I feel the need to. The fact is it can't be disproven, and therefore the question can be decided on questions other than the date, but rather the evidence from the rest of Scripture as to what is under discussion in the book. And that is not as difficult as one might think when you begin to compare the Scriptures with Scripture. Remember how many times Revelation alludes to Old Testament Scriptures. Looking at those Scriptures can tell us something. And that's what we're going to have to do as we study the book. But I do want to acquaint you with all four views and their strengths and weaknesses, which we will do in our next lecture. I apologize I went considerably longer than I wanted to tonight. I really want to get through the book of Revelation in this school, and I had to drag it on a little later tonight than usual.